Okay, so let's look at a game that was played this morning on Lichess. So we're playing black, and white opens with the English opening. So what we do first, and this is advice I got from International Master Andras Toth, is look at the game before we do the engine analysis and try to identify some key points in the game and what we might have done differently. So white opens with c4. So if you notice here, I'm not going with any database or engine analysis. I'm just looking at how we respond. So in this case, what I've been doing is responding with with e5 and just trying to get to a very solid, top statistically played opening line. White continues with the fianchetto system. So this is what I play with white. I try to get into this system myself. And in the traditional systems in the English opening, sometimes I will go with um, the system with pawn to f5, really controlling the center. So in this game, I want to focus on has my understanding of the center improved. So everything I'm trying to do in this game is focused on central control. But in the fianchetto system, I know from previous computer research that f5 is probably bad, so I don't go for that and just go for a stable setup. So on f6, and then he plays the fianchetto, which of course is fine. And here I just go, instead of with pawn moves, I just simply play into c6. So then he plays e3. Now, what I was assuming, of course, is that he was trying to do energy to e2 with the idea of pushing d4. And of course, he could try to push d4 anyway. So because of this, and because I'm trying to really aggressively focus on the center, when I saw this move come in, that was, I think, preparing for a d4 push, uh, and with specifically with the idea that his knight on c3, which is normally developed first, was missing. I think he's gone slightly out of order. My suspicion is he's gone slightly out of order in the opening book here. So I immediately attack with d5. So don't be shy about the center. Go right after it, hoping to throw him off balance. So in this case, he decides to take in the center, which probably is a good decision. You're taking a wing pawn and capturing a center one, so that usually is okay. We capture back with the knight, and now he plays on a c3. So now we have a decision to make, and what I wanted to do here was to focus on my bishops, get those into the game, and get king safety. So we want to focus on development and the center. So here, I don't capture, which would leave him a very strong pawn majority in the center, good control over the white squares with the bishop. So I don't want to capture on c3, I don't think. And instead played bd6, backing up that knight, getting a minor piece developed, and continuing my control over d5. So he continues with f3, and this is a move that really surprised me. So it does make some sense to go after this pawn on e5, given that this knight is the only piece defending it. So if somehow he can come down here with the b pawn and somehow undermine this knight, which is controlling the center, then this pawn could potentially be in trouble. So I'm looking at my last bishop and I'm thinking about where to put it. And I'm feeling as if b to d6 would not be smart, even though it would back up this pawn, but that knight is not really under threat right now. If we can get to the b file, we prevent for the time being this b pawn push, which could undermine this knight. So I decided to play bishop to b4, but I wasn't totally convinced about this move. This indirectly attacks this piece. Sometimes in a lot of the English systems, you take out the knight on c3, which of course is doing a superb job of controlling the center. So that could be a reason to capture it. But I just wanted the piece developed, and I was trying to think of a good square to get it to. So now both sides opt for king safety, so I don't think any issue here. And I still think this knight move was suspicious by white. So we'll see what the engine and the opening database says, because I think NG really should have gone to e2 with the idea of a d4 push, and also having played e3, I don't think it makes sense for white to block this diagonal, because that bishop, of course, is quite strong. So here he plays a3, and I think maybe this is again something that I don't think White had enough focus on the central control here. I think something like potentially d4 might have made sense to again attack this pawn and so forth. So I've got to think about what I want to do. And in this case, with my bishop under pressure, decide to take out the knight to retain this strong central control. So we'll see if that's right. I was contemplating either bishop to c5 or just simply dropping back, but the problem is that there isn't really a pin. If this pawn had somehow already been played and his king was still on e1, then this pin, then bishop to a5 might make more sense. But without the pin in place, it doesn't seem like we're getting much with bishop to a5 was my thought. So I decided to take the knight to take away a piece controlling the center. So he has a choice of how to recapture, and in this case decides to recapture by coming back into the center, which I think is sensible. So these pawns are a little bit, their configuration is a little bit wrong, and both these moves have been slow, especially this e3. But so we do have to be a little bit careful, but I do like the control that I have with my e5 pawn and these minor pieces, which I think also have a development lead over him. He has 2 minor pieces developed and I have 3. So I'm happy with what's going on in the center so far. So in this case, I'm thinking about my remaining pieces and where they should go. So with the idea of this pawn potentially being weak, what I wanted to do was get my rooks going. I could play queen to d7 here and connect the rooks and get this rook to maybe into the center. It would be nice to have this on the d file. And so queen to d7 might be wrong. And so for the time being, I wasn't sure what to do. So I just played rook to e8, just controlling getting the rook to the central files. So now b to b2, and I think we'll see what the engine analysis says, but I thought this was potentially bad, but maybe not, because if he can push, it seems like he can safely push c4 with a tempo and then get extra control over this pawn on e5. So at this point, I played a move that I wasn't sure about. And in this case, I'm thinking about the bishop being on e6. The idea of the knight coming into g5 could potentially be a problem. We really wouldn't want to lose this bishop and leave him with the bishop pair. So I played a weakening move. Well, it strengthens the pawn on e5, but with f6, I'm not sure about that one. So we'll have to look at what the engine's evaluation says about that. So in this case, he decides to play d4, and I think this does make some sense. It's disruptive to the center. But when he's already blocked his bishop on b2 with c4, it might have made sense to just simply push c4. So we'll see what the engine says. But in general, I do like the approach of trying to combat the center. So I did agree with that. Now the heat is starting to appear on this pawn, and the question is, we have tension in the center, and we don't want to release the tension in the center unless it benefits us. But in this case, I decided to take, and the reason I decided to take was I'm looking at my rook development on e8, and I'm thinking that if I capture, then I will have excellent control over the center. His rook is not developed to the center yet. We could potentially get our other rook to the d file where his queen is. So even though the d file remains blocked, I thought it best to capture on d4. So we'll see what that says. So he comes in with the c pawn, and again, I think is a good decision from the perspective that you're taking a wing pawn and capturing in the center, which does make a lot of sense. But now I'm looking at this position, and the ideal blockader for a pawn, of course, is a knight. Absolutely perfect piece to do that. But now I'm starting to get really concerned about the idea that he has these central pawns, and I have to be very careful, because if he somehow were able to get in e4, as he is, of course, right now, if he were to have a second move, then I would start to get really hit with tempos. These minor pieces would have to go backwards, which we definitely don't want. And we could potentially get into a scenario very quickly where we would be in retreat mode and these two pawns would become very dominant. He can easily play rook to e1 start driving this pawn. So I really want to focus on this pawn specifically on e3 and the idea of the control over the e4 square. So this move I really liked, and I played bishop to f5. And the idea here, of course, is that we immediately control this advance, so we prevent the advance of this pawn. But the other thing is that given that we've developed our rook to the e file, we now have a semi-open file and some extra control over e4. So both these moves, so this of all the moves in the game, this is probably the one I was happiest about because I'm just exclusively focusing on the center. So he plays r to c1. It's a developing move. It's maybe, I can't really think of a strong criticism of it. I mean, the rook does come to an open file. It certainly should develop. I don't quite know. I mean, I don't think this knight is really threatened at this point. I started to think about the idea that he might play an exchange sacrifice on c6. My pawn structure would be a little weak. And so it might have some validity, and it, of course, would also take out a piece that's controlling the center. But for the time being, I wasn't so concerned about it. So here, I'm just thinking about, I sort of lost the plot here. I wasn't quite sure to continue development. So I thought that this rook should certainly retain control over the open file. So I didn't want to interfere with that and wanted to connect the rooks. I'm not quite sure what I want to do on the queen side yet, so I opted for queen to d7. Now he starts to make some interesting moves. Okay, so again, we're completely focusing on e4. So when he plays knight to h4, this I think was an important moment because this is exactly why I think his knight should have come to e2 in the first place, because it's definitely valid to open the light square control into the center, so he gets the power of his bishop back, basically, which I do think is a really good idea, and of course hits my bishop on f5. But again, thinking about control over e4, my thought here was that his bishop on g2 was his strongest minor piece at this point. You can see with this one, this bishop is quite bad. He has no pawn break on the c file to potentially disrupt this. So this, if I can fix this pawn on d4, I should be in good shape. So recognizing that his light squared bishop is really strong, I decided to just go into e4 with the idea that we offer the trade and we blockade the advance, of course, to e4. The only thing that concerned me about this is that if he recaptures, it's probably a good trade for us, but our rook maybe is a little bit misplaced on e4 and would be vulnerable. I mean, as we'll see in the game, the other thing is that that f6 is difficult for him to do because e3 is vulnerable, and that played a role later in the game. But I just wanted absolute focus on the e4 square. So in this case, he decides to play f3 to disrupt this bishop. And this is where I recognize that I probably would have no choice but to go into a pawn and rook for two minor pieces exchange, because the drawback of this move, obviously, is that e3 is weakened. So that's why, without this rook having been developed, he's paying a bit of a price for not having much control on the e file. So we decide to take on e3, hitting the queen and the rook. And the other thing is, of course, the other good thing about this move is we're completely undermining the support for the d4 pawn as well. So we're willing to give up this blockading knight in order to disrupt the pawn structure and break the support of d4. The only thing I started to think about was the possibility that he could potentially push this now. And so, but he, in the meantime, he has a uh, a, a, a double hit here on the rook and queen to deal with. So he certainly has to sort that out first. And this is where I thought maybe I had completely blown the game, because this is where this it'd be interesting to see what the engine says about f6, because the one drawback of that is that it does weaken this g8 to a2 diagonal. So he has to get his queen out of the pressure from the knight and gets in with a check. And I thought maybe I had blown the game here. But luckily, with this bishop, what it, in taking the e4 pawn, and this is why this controlling the center and breaking up the pawn structure was so important. Taking out e, what I then do is I'm able to come back again with tempo. So you want to always be able to ideally save your pieces with tempo, because white just has a further problem on the queen. So as long as we can continue hitting the queen, we should be okay. So he now has to, so I still have the threat of knight takes f1, and he still has the issue of how to deal with this queen. So he decides to take, and I'm going to call it a poison pawn, down on b7. And I wasn't so worried about this because as I looked at this, I recognized this is a little scary with the rook on c1. But we have good control with the bishop and the queen protecting c6. He's decided to take this pawn, but then I recognized that his bishop on b2 was hanging, right? So here he actually, after playing this move, resigned. But my move, and we'll see if this is correct, but in looking at this, and I paused a little bit after the game to see about this, that I think rook to b8 would have been okay. This pawn is protected, but whether it was or not, we would be able to go right after the bishop on b2. So let's go back to the beginning, turn on the database, and turn on the engine. So we'll get livebook going, and then we'll turn on the engine. So opening theories, so e5, it actually statistically nf6 is the top line move, but I just got in with e5. He goes into the fianchetto system, and I just play the knight's development. So top line moves so far. Now here's a question. So machine, this is interesting. So this is the first learning point. So I went with NSC6 here, but the database is showing me that I actually could have played d5 right on the spot. So that's interesting. This is part of the adjustment into seizing the center. So I actually didn't even contemplate that move, but that's actually quite interesting. If he were to recapture and I recapture with a knight, something like e4 would potentially be bad because he would just simply be blocking his own bishop. So I didn't actually think of d5. That's a really interesting point. So I play into c6, and we can see here that he made a mistake. So this I did notice in the game that my thought was that he should have into c3 in. So you can see these top line moves, into c3 being absolutely stock standard move in the English opening. So I think he should have seized on that opportunity first, but instead e3, which I think is very inconsistent with this play here. So now so we're getting kind of almost out of book, and there are very few games that are remaining. So, and I think partly in part because of that move, but also sort of mine. I could have done d5. So we're drifting out of book. So at this point, we can probably actually look at the idea. So I did d5 here. I was happy about that because of the control of the center. The database is showing that b to c5 is a slightly more common move here. Obviously, not many games statistically available. But what's interesting is the engine, and you can see with this let's check function is that Stockfish and Houdini both actually liked my move, which was d5, and that's what I thought. It's just seize the center, just control the center. So I was happy about that. So now we're out of book, and we can just go back to the notation. So c takes d5. I just simply recapture, and now into c3, which I did think makes sense. And this is my first real question. So I wasn't sure about bishop to e6. So we'll see how it's playing. But as you can see in the evaluation here, it's already showing me over 200. I say that 100 meaning a pawn. So over 2 pawns, 2.24. So, but what's interesting is the machine's noting a move that I actually didn't think of, and it's saying n at d to b4. So this didn't occur to me at all, but I guess what it's pointing out is that the king, and this is a good opportunity to learn from this too, because we've seen many games with this feature too. If the opponent doesn't get the king to safety right away, there's an opportunity to look for ripping the center open and the potential files in the center open. And I guess what the machine is pointing out from here is that, and this is like quite a difference. Like it's saying that this is a clear miss on my part. So I just wanted development, but I can kind of see how bishop to e6 isn't wonderful. I mean, it sort of develops towards the center. It does reinforce d5, but it's not brilliant. So this I didn't even consider. So this is interesting. So nd to b4 with the idea of hopping in here. So with this pawn already moved, there's no way this will be backwards. And so almost he would be, in a way, it seems like almost you'd have to play some kind of really weakening move. Like I'm wondering if even seizing d4 right away might be good, but I think that's just vulnerable to capture, and the engine's confirming that. So that's quite interesting. And then if something even slower, let's say d3, then it would be, of course, a target, and we could either attack or as the engine. And so I see that taking on d3 would have been absolutely valid because of course we have the queen still at d8. But the other thing is it's saying just reinforce with the bishop. And then I would have thought that might block it, but then I guess we drop back to e6 and we still have this backwards pawn and this weakness here. So that's interesting. That's I didn't actually consider that. So instead I played bd6 as a developing move. He plays nf3, and this is, oh, and that actually completely changed the evaluation. So this was actually like quite a significant mistake on my part. So I have to really watch for that. If d6 opens, let's really get in there and seize that. So this actually brought the game back to even, according to the engine analysis. So this was a big mistake on my part. So this was a move I was suspicious about, this nf3, but the evaluation is actually showing it's okay. I personally thought it should have gone to e2. Let's maybe look at that. Is that a mistake? It is kind of saying it's a mistake. So it's saying that I could have captured on c3 with b takes c6 here, doubling the pawns, but I guess with this potential push of the pawn eventually to c5, it still likes my center control. So that surprised me. I didn't think the engine would approve of this, but somehow it has. So nf3, again, in terms of controlling the center, much better to be on f3 than e2. I did think that e2 would support the push of d4, but again, better square for a center control over the dark squares here in the middle. So then I go with bishop to b4. And this is not, so the evaluation here, it's not horrendous, but it preferred things like, and I didn't even think of this, bishop to e7. That seemed really slow. I don't quite know what its plan there is. Maybe to f6. It also thought of f5, which I didn't think about, but you could switch back to the f5 system, which is usually played earlier in the opening, which I don't do against fianchetto, but f5, of course, it has validity because we don't want his knight coming into e4, so that's a move I didn't even consider. f5 would have been good, so the engine seems to be excited about that. Bishop to b4, not horrendous, but seems like it was slightly inefficient. So now we just go into king safety, so no comments here, and then a3 potentially pushing it away. So machine approves of that, and now we have a decision. So it actually, and this is interesting, it preferred knight takes c3 slightly. I say very slightly, but it doesn't seem to be much difference between the two, with the idea, of course, that white has to deal with that right away because of the attack on the queen. So I guess the idea was that the bishop would then drop back to c5. Well, let's play it through. So if we do this, and let's say it wants the queen out, so it does b for the sake of argument, and then it actually wanted the trade of queens, which is interesting. And then d takes. Oh. What? Entity 4. Oh no, of course. So it has to be r takes d1. And then I was curious where this would go, and it actually wants to drop back to e7. So bishop to e7 I actually didn't even think about. So I decide to take with a bishop, and he decides to capture towards the center. So at this point, I simply wanted development and central control. So we had r to e8, and then he plays bishop to b2. And I thought this was quite poor. I didn't think going behind that pawn was too good, and it was a little slow. It would control the dark squares in the center and does a lot of c4 push, so maybe it's not too horrendous. Machine doesn't hate it. So now f6. This was too weakening. So we're seeing here that n at n to b6 was recommended. So what it wants simply is that, and this surprises me a little because the knight is I thought in a good controlling square. So I didn't really want to leave the center, but I am seeing that he does have these pawns available as a push. So the engine seems to be pointing out that if we come back to b6, we could potentially we could reroute it to c4, which would hit this bishop. Of course, it does also open the influence of the e file, so we could have done that. So this bishop now springs to life, controlling these white squares. We could get back into here, sort of making this backwards, hitting this. So that's interesting. And of course it opens the d file for the queen. So that's another move that I didn't really consider. d4 is played. So now it again, and it's showing the evaluation in the game, by the way, as almost even at this point. So I decided to capture here, which it definitely does not approve of. So this was a mistake. So it is really keen on this n to b6 move. Really, really keen on this, which really, that's a tough one for me to see because it's such a good blockader there, and it's got such control over the center. That would have been a very tough one for me to find. So that's something that I'm not quite understanding yet. But it says this capture was absolutely incorrect. So we go back to b6. We could cut. Let's just play this through just to see how it might have continued. So let's say it's queen to c2. I would have thought n to c4. But queen to e7 potentially too. So these are moves that I'm not entirely understanding. I guess the idea there is rook a to d8, which does make sense. I see. So part of the reason of n to b6, I was thinking more that it would hop into c4, but it seems like the engine was more excited about the idea that the rook on a could come to d8. So that's interesting. So this capture was wrong on my part. So here, when he recaptures, what I do here, and it shows white with quite a lead. So again, it likes n to b6. So I just didn't see this move. So anyway, I control e4, and he plays r to c1, which again isn't horrendously bad. And now we play queen to d7, which and it's showing white up about a pawn at this point. So all these moves seem to be relatively similar in valuation. So I don't think this is any sort of mistake. I think this missing n to b6 earlier and then capturing was more where the mistakes were. So white actually has a good lead at this point. So he plays nh4, and again, I thought this was quite bad. So at this point you see his valuation slipping. It's down to 0.42, and the machine did in fact like my move here, b to e4. And again, I just thought really attack that bishop on g2 because it's so strong. I know it to be strong in the fianchetto system because I play it myself. So then he makes the weakening move f3, and this was the blunder. Like clearly was a mistake. Yeah, so that actually ruined his game. So my central control, even though I didn't play it perfectly, it actually forced him into a serious concession and then really a mistake. Because when I capture on e3, he just ran into big time trouble. So he tries queen to b3, but there's nothing, as long as I don't make any significant mistakes, there's nothing that can save the game at this point. So he tries queen to b3, and then the engine's fine with my move here. You have to play this. So just simply there blocking. So I have the knight supporting it. I have the e file open. The queen is again hit with tempo. And then this is the last thing I wanted to check, that if he takes that poison pawn, I'm assuming it was rook to b8, rook a to b8. And the engine is showing multiple possibilities. So it's saying basically that this game is over. But basically, we could not even worry about this at this point and just simply just capture right away in f1. Our e was a possibility of b8. I don't know that I totally understand that, because I would have thought we would want to keep our rook on the e file, so I for sure would have done the a. Also likes n takes g2, which is now gone to the top line move, which I think is puzzling, because he's blocked his own bishop in with f3, which I think has lost a bit of the power. But I guess its point is that we don't want any recapture here, because then our knight would be vulnerable. But as you can see with the evaluation, there are multiple ways to play this. So I just simply would have opted for simplicity with this. And I think on queen to, I assume to a6. Oh, it actually opts for the just exchanging on the rook. But as you can see with the evaluation, it's up to something like 15, yeah, 25 pawns at this point. So that's a game in the English from this morning. So the central control that I went after ended up winning the game, because we forced the opponent into a mistake. But I missed n to b6, and I also missed the idea of the weakness of the d3 square. I think those are the key themes of the game that I overlooked. So interesting learning moment.